you have to support your request. And you need to support your request with things that matter to the other party. And, it's not because, well, I'm having trouble paying for this daycare bill, or, there's not enough money for me to save for retirement at the end of the month. Like, those are not things that your employer cares about, sorry to say.
Yeah.
So there's an element of data collection that is important on your end as the NP who's asking for a raise. And there's a few different data collection points. You want to collect data about yourself in your job in metrics and language that are important to the employer, i.e. money.
Well, hey there, it's Liz Rohr from Real World NP, and you are watching the Real World NP YouTube channel. We make weekly episodes to help save you time, frustration, and help you take the best care of your patients. Hello. This episode is with my dear friend, Amanda Guarniere. If you've been around here for a bit, you've probably come across her work. She introduces herself in this interview. So I'll let her say more, but in this episode, we're talking about how to negotiate a raise. This is something that can feel very intimidating and overwhelming. And what I love about it, which I say at the end of the episode, is how matter of fact and simple and step-by-step and strategic Amanda is about this process, and makes it feel so accessible and so easy. Well, simple, maybe not easy, but simple, because I know it can be intimidating for people, but it's definitely a question that has come up a bit in the Real World NP community. And I trust Amanda Guarniere as the career navigation expert with the Resume RX as her company to help guide us through this process. So I really hope that you enjoy this interview. Well, thanks for being here. It's wonderful to have you back on.
Yes.
So I feel like you don't need introducing, but I know that there's new people all the time coming into this world of ours. So can you introduce yourself for the people who don't already know you?
Sure. So my name is Amanda Guarniere. I am a nurse practitioner for the past 13 years now, and founder of the Resume RX, which is an educational platform and content site for nurses and NPs to really learn the topics we didn't learn in school about how to find a dream job, how to interview and negotiate and prepare for career advancement, and kind of all the things that go along with that.
So the question came in, and it comes in a bunch. But the other day, someone was like, "How do you negotiate a raise?" And I was looking through your stuff, and I was like, "I don't know if Amanda's talked about. I'm sure Amanda's talked about that, but it would be really fun for us to talk about." Just like have a conversation about that topic. I know it's really stressful for people. And I think that there's like maybe an added layer with nurse practitioners. I don't know. Maybe this is all just my anecdotal experience, but even talking with a friend who's not as a nurse practitioner was talking about asking for a raise today or in the last couple of days. And she's stressed out, but like there's something I think extra with medicine, especially for like maybe people on the newer side. We're not talking specifically about new grads right now. We're talking about people who have a nurse practitioner job and want to advocate for a raise or ask for one. It can still feel a little tricky. And I think that there's a little bit of this like culture of medicine that's like a little bit, I don't know, paternalistic or something. And people don't necessarily want to rock the boat, stuff like that. So if somebody's thinking about that, they've been in their practice for a bit and they're like, I'd really love a raise. Like where would somebody start? If they have that thought, where would you recommend that they start?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And just to kind of frame it a little bit more, I feel like there's a lot of content and information about how to negotiate a salary when you're starting a job, right? And a lot of information about, all right, if you're underpaid, here's how to find a new job. Yes. But maybe the gap in conversation is, all right, I like where I work. I would like to stay here. I'd like to be more fairly compensated, or, there are some things that I want to change. But to your point, there's more to lose almost, right? Because what if they say no? I still have to show up here every day, right? Yeah. So I think that's really, it can feel a bit more emotional, whereas you might feel emboldened to try to negotiate for more money in a job where you're comfortable walking away if you're in the job search, right? So I think that's part of where, and also the kind of paternalistic issues in medicine, I definitely think kind of compound on each other. But I think like the first place to start is, if you feel deep down inside that you want to ask for a raise, like listen to that voice, ask yourself, all right, what is giving me this nudge? There's some sort of disconnect here between, what I feel I'm bringing to the job and what I'm taking home financially from the job. And realizing that it's not going to be like, it's not something that you just do one day, right? You can thoughtfully plan out asking for a raise. And that's really how I recommend doing it.
Mm.
As opposed to when you're negotiating a salary during during a job interview or a job hire situation, where you kind of have to come back quick with, oh no, actually, that's not what I was looking for. Can you do this? This is more something that you can have a bit of a runway for. And the better that you execute that runway, the more likelihood you are to succeed with your original intent
Oh,
of
I love
getting what you
that.
ask for.
I love that. I've actually, it's occurring to me, I don't know if I've ever asked for a raise. I don't think I ever have in any of my jobs. And actually, maybe I did as a collective with our nurse practitioners. We had a conversation about we'd like to adjust compensation for all of us across the board.
Yeah.
So having, I love that piece of like a runway. It doesn't have to be high pressure. It doesn't have to be high stress. It's like take the air out of the balloon a little bit. Planning a runway. So what does that look like for people? Like what are let me rewind. What are some of the factors? I think that maybe some of the factors that go in from maybe an employer side would be helpful for people to understand. Like, what are some of the factors that go into that conversation from the employer's perspective? I think that like some people go in and they're just like, well, they're just going to say no because there's no money. But like, I don't know, can you speak to either of those pieces? I think they're kind of interrelated. Like, what is that kind of runway that leads up to it? But I think it's really influenced by what actually matters to the employer in that conversation. So wherever you want to take it.
100%. That's a great point. And that's really a perspective that's important to keep as you're going into these conversations, because the kind of knee-jerk reaction to the question, can I have a raise, is why. They're not necessarily going to say why, right? But like you have to support your request. And you need to support your request with things that matter to the other party. And, it's not because, well, I'm having trouble paying for this daycare bill, or, there's not enough money for me to save for retirement at the end of the month. Like, those are not things that your employer cares about, sorry to say.
Yeah.
So there's an element of data collection that is important on your end as the NP who's asking for a raise. And there's a few different data collection points. You want to collect data about yourself in your job in metrics and language that are important to the employer, i.e. money.
Yeah.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, like you
different
need to
ways
find
of talking
the
about
money.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, if I'm asking for a raise, I'm planning ahead and I'm pulling my productivity reports, right? I'm pulling RVUs generated. I'm pulling how many patients I'm seeing. I'm pulling my no-show rate, all types of stats that indicate that I am making this practice or this facility a lot of money. And hopefully you're privy to that type of information, or at least privy to enough of it that you can come up with data to support your request, right?
Yeah.
So you may or may not know exactly what you're getting reimbursed from, Blue Cross for a 99214. But if you do, then you can do some back of the napkin math, look at what you've coded over the past 2-3 months, assume those collection figures, and be able to have at least a back of the napkin number of, all right, here's the revenue I've generated for the practice now compared to maybe when I started, right? Because you want to show the difference. You want to show why you're asking now, and why the practice should theoretically have more money now than they did before.
Yes.
Right. So that's definitely part of the data that you want to collect about yourself. You can also put in things that are more qualitative things. So are you Are you taking on certain responsibilities? Are there other things that you touch inside of the organization that are helping with efficiency, with generating revenue, with all the things that matter to the employer? And should there be a monetary value for that work? So those are kind of the things that you want to collect data about over the past, I don't know, whatever look back period you decide you're going to look at. I think usually 3 to 6 months is a good look back period. And then you also want to look for data, not necessarily about yourself, but about things out in the world, right? Yeah. So what are NPs making in similar roles in similar geographies? What has the inflation rate been year over year for the past few years? And kind of looking at all of that and being prepared, having it written somewhere so that you can eventually take it into the conversation. And we can kind of go down that path a little bit further after we chat about what I just talked about.
Totally. Yeah. I'd love to keep going with that. I think I want to pause for a sec, because I think that there are people who are people who are new and who are experienced who might not be as familiar with some of the pieces that we've introduced. So and it comes, so I guess just to recap, the thing that you want to be prepared for is like, you're almost building a case of like why you need a raise. And hopefully your employer has already considered cost of living and inflation increases just at baseline. Because I think that people kind of expect like, why am I not getting a salary increase every year? And that's usually where that comes from, is like that, at least from my perspective. So correct me if there's other things that I'm not thinking of, but typically if an employer is giving you raises, it's because of that reason. But the other reasons that you can collect data on are how many patients you see, how many patients your no-show rate. So the percentage of patients week over week that don't come to their scheduled appointments. So if you're booked for 20 a day, are you seeing 16 patients? And what is that average over time? Your no-show rate is that's the terminology that people in clinics use. And then you have your, so that's like that's like productivity, quote unquote, is like how many patients you're seeing versus not seeing. And then how much revenue does that bring in? And the way that you see that is when you're looking at your billing codes, whether you bill 99212, 3404, things like that. Every single one of those billing codes brings in a different amount of money. And so did I get that? Do you think that I explained that all clearly for those pieces? I'm thinking of like the new grads, or I'm thinking of people like in my clinic, like I worked in a federally qualified health center for actually all of my jobs. And we didn't really have that data readily accessible. And we also used Medicaid and Medicare, and the reimbursement rates were not the same as like a private insurance. And so it was almost like a flat rate. Like it made a tiny difference if you saw a 4 versus a 3. But it wasn't huge. And then we also didn't necessarily have easy access to that data. So that's my other follow-up question is like, how do people, like, have you worked in a clinic or heard of people in clinics where they have ready access to that? And also, can you speak to RVUs, like what that, I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about what RVU means.
Sure. So I think that some practitioners have access to that data, particularly if they are working in a private practice setting where they may already have some sort of productivity-based pay or bonus incentive, right? Mm-hmm. So typically there's some sort of feedback loop where you are getting information of the number of patients or the value of the patients that you saw, which is then translating to some additional bonus or compensation. So I think that category of people probably has the most precise data about productivity, right? But to your point, right, for those who don't get access to any sort of financials of the clinic, then we're kind of doing what I call back of the napkin math, where you're kind of reverse engineering, looking at your averages, looking at, what maybe the lowest payers are paying you per visit to kind of figure out the lowest possible revenue that you're generating for the practice. In terms of RVU, it stands for relative value unit. And it's kind of like a standardized value, a standardized number or unit that CMS, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, have assigned for particular procedure codes. And we say procedure codes, it might not be an actual bedside procedure, but we're talking about all the things that we do that are codable. So an outpatient visit, different levels of outpatient visits will have a different RVU allotment to them. And so the way to standardize that across all sorts of settings and practices is with this RVU number, so that you can kind of compare apples to apples, so to speak. Because if I'm working in the emergency department, I'm not doing 99213 or 4 outpatient visits, right? I'm doing emergency level visits, and I'm doing suturing and incision and drainage, right? And so RVU assigns a value that really speaks to like the time it takes and the funds generated by that activity. So there are a lot of practice settings that will have either RVU based expectations for their providers or RVU based compensation for their providers. So typically, if someone has productivity based pay, it's based on the RVU expectation that they have in a given quarter. Usually these are looked at quarterly.
Cool. Yeah, that's really helpful to hear. And I've definitely have had colleagues that work in like a private practice or like a hospital-based clinic, and they had monthly check-ins, and it was kind of stressful, actually. It sounded really stressful, but it would almost like you'd post your stats. And it was like, I don't know. I don't know if I believe in that practice of like doing it in front of other people, because that's like, oh my God. But it also is occurring to me that maybe patient reviews, I have a lot of feelings about like the press ganey stuff. I'm not a fan, but maybe if that's something that your clinic really believes in, like I think that for this particular person, they also included patient feedback as part of like the data picture.
Definitely.
So yeah, I think that's really helpful to hear. And I think that if and this is what I would do if I was in that setting again, and I was looking for my data and I wasn't provided it, like I can't imagine going back through my EHR and just like looking at my visits. Like, well, so I would probably go to my office manager, because they do have this information somewhere. Somebody's looking at this information, even if it's not readily available. Like you can ask your office manager, for example, of like, hey, I'm really looking to kind of get an understanding of the patients that I'm seeing, the number I'm seeing, the no-show rate, like just listing those things. And I imagine that they would readily help you out with that, because I mean, if I was an employer of my team member, I'd probably be like, oh, they're going to ask for a raise in a second. But I would be like, oh, okay. So my, like the person I'm supervising, like I would be happy to know that they cared about their data, because we all want to give healthcare. We all want to do a good job. We want to keep the doors of the clinic open. And so even if they are going to ask for a raise, like number one, I want to give it to them if I have money for it. But then also it's nice to know that they are caring about it, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but so it sounds like, okay, so data collection, you're looking over the past 3 to 6 months. And then are you comparing it to when you first started? I guess I'm wondering about like when people, I think I imagine this question would come up of like, when do I even ask for a raise? Is it like annually? Is it, you know what I mean? Like any sort of thoughts on that? Because I mean, sometimes people get annual reviews, but I don't know if everybody gets them. I don't know if that's the time, because that's kind of a pressured situation, you know, but.
Yeah. Yeah, I think annually is a nice cadence, or at least thinking about whether you've had some sort of period where there's been an increased expectation. So let's say you've been asked to take on more in some capacity, or let's say your clinic is understaffed or something like that. So waiting, I think, 3 months from a major change. That way you have that look back period to say like, hey, 3 months ago, I was a team player and increased my capacity for visits by 20% because we have been understaffed. And, here's the data I've collected. And, I'm happy to continue working at this capacity. And with that, because of my increased productivity, I'd like to kindly ask for XYZ. And we can kind of, the next step to give some foreshadowing is to decide what you're asking for.
Yes.
So, but to answer your question, I'd like to see people getting at least an annual raise, or at a shorter increment if there's been some other significant change.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah. So where do people go from there of deciding how much or what to ask for? And you and I have talked in the past about compensation is not necessarily all about dollars, right? There's many ways to get
Yes.
compensated in a full kind of package, whether it's your initial thing or negotiating. So yeah, I guess if that's the next step of like how should people work on deciding what they're going to ask for? And then maybe
Yeah.
after that, we can talk about the actual asking because it's just so nice to hear you speak so matter of factly and plainly and that energy. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to copy that script, play it back over and over again. I'm just going to use that tone. Go ahead. First question is, how do they decide what they want to ask for, considering that it's not just about dollars, that there's a full
Right.
compensation package?
Yes. Yes. So, yes, you're totally right. I like to talk about this all the time, that compensation, there's so many different factors to it than just the actual top line salary amount on your offer letter, right? So, what I really recommend is doing a little bit of an audit of your current total compensation package. So, this could be as simple as taking a piece of lined paper, folding it in half, and say, on the left side of that paper, writing current or now or whatever it is, and listing down kind of piece by piece what's included in your compensation. So, your salary amount, of course, and then any productivity or bonus structure that you might have. And then going deep into all the different benefits that are included. How much PTO do you get? What's your CME allowance financially and time wise? And list everything that you know that you get that's some sort of benefit, including as granular as what's your expected schedule, the times that you are expected to work, how much administration time do you get? Do you have any helpers? Like, do you have a medical assistant? Do you have a scribe?
Oof.
All those types of things. So like write down everything that you have, and then think about what prompted you to think, "Oh, I should ask for a raise." Is it something that there's a struggle in your household with the actual amount of dollars that's coming into your bank account? If that's a big pain point of yours, then you're probably going to be asking for more money. If you are feeling totally burnt out and like all you do is work, 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 then maybe you're asking for more PTO, or maybe you're asking for a schedule modification. Whatever it is, like you can decide whatever that you want that ask to be, and aim high, right? Ask for something in every category if you want.
Yeah.
That may not be what you get, and we can kind of in the next phase decide what you're willing to accept. But at least when you're starting this process and you're ideating and you're dreaming of, all right, best case scenario, what does this raise look like? That's how I would approach it.
I love that. I'm getting like a little bit of nervous system activation just thinking about asking myself. I'm like trying to put myself in there. I'm like, oh. So it is scary. I just want to normalize that. And I think the other thing that kind of came up for me was like, oh shoot, I just lost it. I guess have you ever heard of people? I think that there's a worry that people have. I think the thing that's kind of coming up for me is like it just feels, I guess, two things. So one, it feels scary to think about making this dream list and like kind of coming in and being like, I want all of these things, and then they're just like, no. Number one is like, have you, and you might not be able to speak to this, but is there a risk for people getting let go because they asked for a raise? I don't know. I don't know if you can even speak to that. And I don't know what the laws are, and maybe it's state to state or whatever. But I think kind of like on the tail end of that is like the thing that's kind of coming in to support that for me is like, you believe in the justification of it, right? Like, I mean, first of all, we all deserve to have as much money and time off as we want and wellness. And like, we all deserve that at baseline. So like embedding that in there and further believing in the story that you're telling based on all that information But yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that? Like I guess like as we're approaching how to have that conversation, if we've decided, I think I can see people being like, well, I want the moon, but like, how do I go about and ask for that without like totally getting, worried about
Yeah.
getting fired or like clamming up, or how do I even say that with a straight face and I'm not like running away?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you have to decide on an amount or an ask that feels good to you, right? It needs to feel good in your body. And if it doesn't feel good in your body, it's going to be hard for you to communicate it. I think also you want to leave yourself some room for growth, right?
Yeah.
So maybe part of the ask is, you know, here's where I'd like to be 2 years from now.
Mm.
How can we get there? So I
Oh,
kind
I
of
love that.
I like that. I like that type of approach when asking for a raise because it shows it's disarming, right? It shows that you are thinking about the future. You want to be with this organization long term. You also have goals for yourself and you want to decide together how to make that happen. So that's my favorite way to go into the conversation. But to back up, you need to have an ask that you feel good about, that leaves you some room for growth, and yeah, something that like it has to be a reasonable request,
Yeah.
right? And that's where your data comes in, the data of the supporting data that's not yours. So the supporting data of what other NPs are making and the normalizing data, right? Like this is what's customary. This is what other people in our area are making for the same amount, like the normalizing data. So, and the other piece too is you could have all sorts of different motivations for asking for a raise. You could love your organization and you want to stay there long term. You want to lead the team. You want to be a director level someday or whatever it is. Your approach is going to be different than you've actually got another offer and
Mm-hmm.
you would stay for the right amount in this job,
Yeah.
right? So that's going to have you approaching the conversation differently, making asks in a different way. And so, like, you might be coming up with an offer that matches what another company is offering you, um, in an effort to stay because it's less friction to stay, or because you like it in your current job better, that type of thing. So there's like so many
Mm.
factors in determining, um, but it's your choice what you get to ask for,
Yeah.
um, and just kind of keeping in mind how it's going to be received. Is it going to be received in a way that's a realistic ask, and how are you going to present it,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that keeps you in a favorable light and not as someone who's trying to rock the boat or whatever. And you asked, is there a risk of being let go? It depends. Like if you're like, this is what I want, and if you don't give it to me, then I'm going to walk. Then if they can't do it, they can't do it.
Yeah.
You have to keep in mind that healthcare is a business. Everyone has to balance their books at the end of the day. Not every business is run really well. So even
Yeah.
if you know how much money you're generating for a practice, that doesn't mean it's all sitting in a pile somewhere waiting for
Yeah.
you to get it.
Yeah.
Like it's being spent elsewhere, and that's not your fault. But just kind of keeping that in mind that they sometimes can't make it come out of nowhere if it's tied up elsewhere.
Mm.
So a lot of directions to go in, from here.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to, even if there's multiple directions, I think that the framing of partnership is helpful because I think a lot of people come in, whether it's just like the overarching conception of what negotiations are supposed to be, that it's this confrontational thing of like I want this thing and they're going to say no, and how do I argue for it, and it has to be this like really intense thing versus like what you said is like like I think that I don't know, maybe this is my own anecdotal experience, but it seems like the people who employ us like, they want the best for the company, for the mission. They want to support us. And so, yeah, so if we can approach it from that perspective of like, this is the story, here's what I need. How can we make this happen? And then just having a conversation going back and forth. So yeah, I guess, do you have any thoughts about that? Like in terms of what are the typical, or what are some options in terms of preparing ahead of time? Because I think that for me, if I'm thinking about doing this myself, it's nice to know like different options, right? I think the worst case scenario I'm envisioning is like, no, you're fired for asking. Which like, I don't think that's real, right? But it's like, what are the potential things that you see for people? It's like, well, excuse me. And like one of the things I've heard from people is like, they're just like, oh, not right now, or they're like, okay. Like, what are some of the things that people might say back? Just in terms of preparation of next steps, because I think that sometimes people are so new to this that they might just freeze and be like,
Yeah. So I think one thing that I want to say before I forget is
yes.
there's a really wonderful book called Never Split the Difference by Christopher Voss, who
Cool.
is a well-known hostage negotiator, and really interesting book. And it's all about negotiation and the dynamics of negotiation. And I think, to go back to the point of, so many people get kind of hyped up that it has to be this intense exchange. Really your job in this scenario is to disarm the other person,
Mm-hmm.
right? To really to take away that energy of it being a confrontation. So I would like that word disarm is what I would kind of keep in mind as you're thinking about this. The other thing is along the lines of preparing, right? Like we said from the top of the episode, preparing in advance is really smart. You want to know, before you ask for the meeting, which we'll talk about in a minute, you want to determine what is your BATNA, BATNA, which stands for your best alternative to the negotiated ask. So that's a common acronym that's used in negotiation. And basically what you're determining is, what are you going to accept, right? You know what you're going to ask for. Like, here's the moon, all the things that you want. But at the end of the day, after the conversation happens, what is what you're willing to accept and settle for if you don't get everything that you ask for, which is entirely possible. So know what that is. And then you're going to ask for a meeting, and you're not going to say what it's about. So you're going to, ask for a meeting. Hey, hey boss, are you free next Tuesday at 3:00 for a quick meeting? If they ask what it's about, you can say, I prefer to discuss it in person. Leave a little bit of mystery, like have them feeling a little bit uncomfortable. Like, I'm not, I don't mean to say like be very misleading, but just thinking from their perspective, if you are a super valuable employee and you've asked for a meeting and haven't told them what it's about, what are they worried about? They're worried you're going to quit.
Yes.
They're worried that you're going to quit and they're going to be up a creek, right? So, so they may be pleasantly surprised to hear that you love working there, and there's a bit of an ask to keep you happy, right? Yeah. So being strategic about asking for the meeting, not disclosing what it's about, not giving them time to come up with a case to say no. And then in that meeting, you present your case, and it's positive, it's collegial. I love working here. Here's all the things that I contribute to. Here's why I'm happy. Here's some of the data of why I'm so valuable. Here's some of the data of what else is going on in the real world. And, I have a goal of increasing my salary to XYZ and would love to discuss an additional week of PTO. How can we get there? And, you could get a no right away. And my response to that would be, I really would love for you to take some time to think about this without there being an immediate response. So can we meet again next week, or can we set up a time to discuss, in a certain time period from now? And that would be, if there's a non-committal answer, I would ask, when When can we reconvene to discuss this further? When can I expect a decision? That type of thing. So not being pushy, but just asking to close the loop.
Yeah.
And
Like a non-answer is not really an option. I mean, people
right.
might try to do it, but like that's what you're trying to avoid in that situation is a non-answer. It's like either a clear yes or no. But
Mhm.
I love what you said about taking some time to consider, because if I'm putting myself in the employer position, if somebody asked for that meeting, I'd expect that they were leaving or that they were going to ask for a raise, and I'd probably prepare for both scenarios. But I know for me in the moment, the way that I process and I think, and I'm just like, oh, I'm not going to have an answer for that, and I'm not going to know what they're like. I have no idea what they're going to ask for. And so maybe I haven't prepared for their ask, but I just need to sit with it and process it. It's not that I don't want to. It's just like I have to look at my budget. Me as a business owner, I'm like, I have to look at my budget. I have to look at the upcoming plans, like where to allocate funds. Like that's where I'm coming from. In a healthcare organization, maybe your clinic director. There's just a lot of moving parts. I haven't been a clinical director, but it sounds like, it's not just the CMO or the chief medical person. It's like, operations gets involved, finances is involved,
Mhm.
like HR is involved. There's a lot of pieces. So I think
Yeah.
that's a really, really important point, is that you might not get an answer that day,
Yeah.
or
And
probably likely you won't get an answer.
right. And expecting that you won't, and kind of going into the conversation respectful of the process.
Yeah.
It's one thing if they're like, yes, we were actually planning to give you a raise tomorrow. Great. That's like the best case
Perfect.
scenario. We can all go home and end this episode, right? But if they're kind of like, oh, I don't know. Hey, I fully understand and respect that this is an operation. This is part of a bigger process. I'm sure there are things on your end that you would want to review in response to my request. So does it make sense for us to set another meeting a week from now after you've done what you needed to do? And you can kind of say like, have had your weekly whatever meeting with, if you know that there's some sort of clinical leadership team meeting that happens weekly, whatever, reflect that back. I'm sure you want to talk this over. So does it make sense for us to set another time to continue the conversation, or whatever that looks like? Because to kind of draw not a parallel, but the opposite of a parallel from negotiating in a job hire situation, this isn't like oh, well, we can do this. Well, we can do this. It's not like a back and forth because it's just different, right? There needs to be some analysis involved
They
to
weren't like
make that
prepared in
decision.
that
They weren't
situation.
exactly.
Versus in a
It's not
hiring,
like,
they know what they have to offer.
yes, 100%.
And I guess I have a question about if you have, I mean, there's different structures, but I'm thinking about when we talked about raises, it was a longer conversation, and it was like, hey, boss, the other NPs and I were talking about like, compensation packages, because everybody was the same, depending on your level of experience. And so it wasn't about individual people asking for their own raise. It was kind of the expectation was that there was like a tier system. And I know that there's some places that are like unionized, and maybe that's a little bit different, but can you speak to anything in terms of that process if it's not individualized in that same way, if it's really like a
Mm,
tier system, or it's like a
yeah,
cohort type of system or something like that?
sure. Sure. It definitely, it depends on where you fall in that cohort, right? Like, are you a member of the group? Are you the lead NP in the group? But I think, if you're a member of the group, uh, it's tricky. You want to do things in a way that doesn't create an us versus them
Mm-hmm.
type of situation, right? That can be very threatening to leadership. Leadership doesn't typically respond favorably to like, we all talked and we think that this is unfair, and
Yeah.
that's not a dynamic that's favorable, right? It can be an effective one, but we want to avoid going there,
Yeah.
because it can just create some irreparable relationships, and a divide between leadership and staff, and really we want to keep that divide to a minimum if we can. So asking for a meeting with the other NPs, or bringing it up. Really, what I would do is bring it up individually to whoever your lead NP is, saying, hey, have you thought about this? Is there an opportunity for us to discuss? Have you thought about bringing this to leadership and requesting a fair market adjustment? that type of thing. So it can be trickier when you're kind of part of a group, but really advocating for yourself and trying not to be someone who stirs the pot, but rather someone who advocates for yourself and your peers, going through the proper chain of command, right? Because they're not going to give a raise to someone who they think is insubordinate, right? Which is unfortunately just the reality of dynamics in a workplace. So I'm a mediator and a peacemaker by nature. So on the spectrum of conflict averse, I'm like very conflict averse. So someone who's not as conflict averse as me may have a difference of opinion, but I think that there's a way to be strong and assertive and get what you want without it being a huge power play.
Yeah, and I love how you phrase it. I mean, words I think words mean things, and I think it makes a big difference in terms of the conversation and relational approach, because it's like what did you say? Have you thought about blah 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 blah, or would you consider blah blah blah, right? Because I think that we come in with this assumption of like, again, maybe I'm just revealing my own stuff, but I feel like
Mm-hmm.
this is I feel this almost like zeitgeist. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's almost like I want to raise and they're going to say no and they don't want to do this, right? I think that's like the leading thing versus like you don't actually know if your leadership is talking about this constantly and they've been working on something and they just haven't announced it yet because it's not ready, right? And so it's not like
Right.
it's like we need a raise. It's like, oh, like have you thought about, and it's just like a conversation to get it started, because ultimately we want to like assume, I don't know, not everybody has positive intent, but we want to assume positive intent, right? And so if you have your lead NP, it's like these are the things we're thinking about because of X, Y, and Z. Have you been talking about that, or have you considered that, right? It's just a little bit more of a conversation. And it's not that we have to be people pleasing or we have to not ask for what we want and what we need, but it's like we can kind of do so in a collaborative way.
Yeah. I really like whenever you can use we, I think goes over really well. So how can we get there is a phrase that I like to use. I think that I said earlier, if you're saying this is a goal of mine, to make whatever amount by the end of the year or whatever it looks like that you're asking for, how can we get there? Or can we discuss a plan of how we can get me there, that type of thing. And don't forget, maybe your requests are also requests for growth,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'd love to see a pathway for me to become the lead NP with our group.
Yeah,
How can we get there?
totally.
And that goes back to deciding what it is you want, because
Mm-hmm.
you might be someone who's motivated by money. You might be someone who's motivated by time. You might be someone who's motivated by recognition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having that good awareness of what motivates you and what makes you feel valued is certainly like way at the beginning of the process, so that you can then have your asks reflect what you know is going to keep you happy and fulfilled and motivated to continue in the job.
I love that. And I guess maybe to wrap up, like, are there any things like after you have this conversation, what are kind of the next things maybe to expect or to keep in mind or follow up with? I don't know. Any things you want to add with that?
Yeah, I think, it really depends on your leadership, but there could be kind of a due diligence period where they're like, we've heard your request. We'd really like to look into it. Can you provide us with this data that you gave to us, right? Because you might have said, NPs in this metro area are averaging X. They may want to see that source.
Yeah.
Or if you say, well, I've increased my collections 10% in the last quarter, they may want to follow that trail to make sure that you're backing up what you're asking for. So I would say be prepared for there to be a request, and that's not and that's not a power play. That's a business doing their due diligence to make sure that they can justify your request. And if anything, questions like that should be seen as favorable. And,
Yeah.
and I don't want to say almost a done deal, but you will get something because if they didn't like you or didn't think that you were deserving of that, or truly did not have any funds to spare, then you would have gotten a hard no, right then and there. And so hopefully that's not the case.
Yeah. Awesome.
And if that is the case, feel free to push back a little bit and say, I really want to know what it looks like to get promoted, or to earn more, or to, make myself more marketable in this profession. And I love it here. And if I'm going to stay here, what does that look like for me? Is there a pathway where I will be earning more? Because, if not, then,
Yeah.
and that's tough to go down, right? You need that. It comes with some element of privilege to be able to say, like if you can't do this for me, then I'm going to be leaving, right? Because it's something you would have to be able to back up, potentially. So we'll save that option for another day.
Just one other scenario I think comes to mind is like, at the end of this quarter or at the mid-year review or something like that. So I guess if there's any thoughts that you have about this of like, hey, like, if it's a non-committal answer, but it's like committed enough where it's like at the end, right? So like a non-committal answer is like, oh, I don't really know. It's like, well, when can we meet next week to talk about it? But if they're like, oh, not right now, but when we get to the end of this quarter, we'll be able to see our finances. And that's like, every quarter's 3 months. I don't know. I guess the thing that's popping in is like being strung along.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not a thing, but I feel like I can see that happening too, where somebody is like, is non-committal, but almost in like a denial way, or like, I don't actually want to confrontationally say no to my employee. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do. I would say, if that conversation happens and it's in person or over the phone, I would put it in writing. I would thank them for the meeting, thank them for their time, looking forward to discussing again next quarter, like you mentioned, after the financials are in, whatever. And then I'm setting a reminder in my calendar for end of quarter, and asking for a meeting again. And my strategy might be different then. You may need to have different leverage, right? If you have someone who's kind of kicking the can down the road, so to speak, maybe you're applying to other jobs and using another offer as leverage. And if that's not enough for the employer to say, yes, we're going to keep you, then, maybe the writing's on the wall for you in that role. And maybe you're honoring your worth and finding a place that can better value you.
Yeah.
Because they should be able to give you something, even if it's not monetary.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe they're like, we recognize all that you've been doing. We recognize your tenure. While we can't give you a salary increase right now, we'd like to give you a title increase, right? Like a consolation prize title increase. And then we hope that later we'll be able to, like, that's a sign of someone who wants you there, who's not kicking the can down the road. So just kind of reading those cues and figuring out if and when it's time to be looking elsewhere, which I'm sure we've covered in another episode.
Definitely. And we can always do more if you want. I love what you said about, in terms of the hard no, the question of what would it look like for me to do X, Y, or Z, whatever the thing you're asking for, like what would it take for me to get to an extra $5,000 or something like that? Because then I think it's like, hopefully they can answer a clear yes or no. And if they can't, then we know. But it's like nice to know that helps inform the reason why they're saying no and what concretely could actually help them say yes.
Yeah.
Or they're just kicking the can down the road, in which case you're like, okay, enough of this. But I love that. And I love how matter of fact you are, because it does feel really unnerving, even for me as somebody who's had many a confrontational conversation, not necessarily in this context, but it still feels confrontational, quote unquote. So I really appreciate you modeling that for people, and having a systematic kind of process just really breaks it down and makes it feel a lot more accessible and easier, even if it's that like simple but not easy thing.
Yeah.
So it can still feel scary, but it's a really, especially if you're thinking of leaving, it's a I would feel like it would be a really worthwhile practice to do, even if you're already like, I'm getting out of here. It might just be nice to practice a negotiation thing and see.
Totally.
And then if they say no, great. And if they say yes, maybe you do want to stay. I don't know.
Totally.
You don't want to like mess with people's, emotions and stuff, but if they're going to say no anyway, then might as well practice. That's scary.
And just to normalize, like, you can feel totally frazzled on the inside. And with practice, be calm, cool,
Yes.
collected, confident on the outside.
Yes.
Right. So
I
that's
second that. I want to second team that, because that's like
right.
every day for me.
Yes. And that's something that comes with practice. Like, even as we're on this interview right now, like, I'm fidgeting. I've got, like, I don't know, the cover to my water bottle in my hand. And it's like, because I know that there's always a buzz of energy that I need to get out elsewhere so that I can keep my tone nice and slow and think about my thoughts. And that comes with practice, right?
Totally.
So just want to normalize that you can feel a frenzy inside, and learn to present more coolly, if you
Yeah.
will, on the outside.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. Any other parting thoughts you want to share with people? Oh, you know what I wanted to share is, I don't know if you still have this, but it was a salary list where people,
Oh
it
yeah.
was like it's your
Yep.
hosted, people submit their salaries, right?
Yeah, there's almost 5,000 entries on there now.
Amazing. So what is it?
So
So just tell people if they don't know what it is.
yeah, so it's called the NP Salary Report. And basically, what it is it's first a survey where, if you are a practicing NP, you submit your salary data anonymously, of course. I collect your email so that I can give you access to the salary report. And then on the back end, when you have access to it, you can sort and filter by all sorts of parameters. So it's not just a simple spreadsheet. You can filter only people in your state or only people in your specialty. It's really quite advanced, so that you can extract the information that you want to support your ask of what are NPs making. So it's free to access. And if you are not yet a practicing NP, there's a question on there that says, are you an NP student? And just click yes there, and you get to bypass the salary entry.
Mm-hmm.
So it's at theresumerx.com/salary.
I love that.
And I hope you check it out.
Yes, I think it'll help contribute to just that pay clarity. Some
Totally.
states have that. I think Massachusetts just passed, or not just, a couple of years ago passed something about
Salary transparency.
Yeah, salary transparency. So I don't know if that's only
on job
Mass,
postings. Yeah, New York City has it as well.
yeah, but there was something about, like, you weren't allowed to talk about, you're not allowed to ask people to keep their salaries confidential anymore or something. I think that's a Massachusetts
Yes.
thing, but
Yes.
I remember that when that passed, I was like, oh.
Mhm.
I'm super nosy, and like I want to talk
Yeah,
about
yeah.
stuff with people, and that's what helps. Transparency with each other is what helps us grow, right? So
Yes.
I love that.
Totally.
Well, any other parting thoughts or words of wisdom or things you want to share? I mean, you're at theresumerx.com. It's obviously going to be in the show notes, but
Yes. Yep.
yeah.
Go visit me on my website or on my Instagram. And then I don't put out new podcast episodes anymore. However, there are 150 something episodes that are still quite relevant on the Nurse Becoming podcast at theresumerx.com/podcast.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.